Alrighty, we got a lot to cover, so I'm going to dive straight into it. This is a breakdown of my session from the most recent Magic Crowdsource library. Some of the inspirations I was pulling from here were Arcane, the TV show. They had some cool thunder and tonal elements in their interpretation of Hextech magic that I thought was pretty cool. And also some of the spells and abilities from the most recent Demon Souls remake, which I thought had this clean, modern sound to it. So just to give you an overview of how this is going to work, I'm going to establish a common baseline and show you some of the raw recordings I made, how I got some basic ingredients out of Whoosh from those recordings, and then we'll go through the actual design layer by layer and finally cover the Mixdown processing. You should also feel free to use the chapter markers for navigating if you want to skip the talk and get straight to the noise. Okay, starting off with the source recordings, this first one was a paper cardstock handling sound. It sounds like this. There's basically just a lot more of that sort of thing. We also have the sound of me taking a rubber raincoat and just like whooshing it past the microphone. That sounds like this. Some standard cloth whooshes. There's also some sustained movement in here as well. Basic rustling, you get the idea. I also got this idea from my friend Juan. This is a metal screwdriver being scraped on a different nylon jacket for almost tonal little zippy zappies, and then taking that same jacket, that nylon one, and doing the same thing, whooshing it past the microphone. So from there, to get some more raw material to work with, I took those sounds, chopped them up into one-shots, and then put them into Whoosh with two goals. One was just for basic standard Whoosh pass-by sounds, and another one was for impacts. So first hearing how the basic whooshes sounded. So pretty standard stuff here. You can see all the settings I have. A little bit of equalization going on, boosting the lows, and also standard hi-fi drive and compression happening as well. I did a couple variations on these with like low and high speeds and messing with the distance and such. And this is primarily the nylon jacket and rubber raincoat whooshes being used as the source material here. Another trick that you can do is if you turn off the host sync and turn on to manual mode, you can sort of scrub through the sound manually using your mouse, which is pretty fun. A lot of noodling to be had there. So the second one that I have set up here is with more of an impact setting. And between these two whoosh ensembles, I was able to get some more interestingly shaped source that I wouldn't consider highly processed, but more just giving me fodder for my processing chains to chew on later down the line. All right, so now that you know what recordings I'm pulling from, let's dive into the actual design. For organizational purposes and also bus processing later on, I broke this down into two main parts, that being the cast, which is first, and the impact, which is second. There's unique bus processing applied to the impact itself, along with a reverb send in the tail. But for the cast, that's just using the same mastering as the rest of it. More on that later. So layer one of the cast sounds like this. And that's just a short reverse snippet of this file that you'll see a lot of later on as well. Little teaser. And to get there, I started with the paper wobbling source, as you can hear here, pitched down a little bit. And this is the processing chain that I applied. This is a pretty classic chain of mine. It essentially takes any paper or other Foley source and turns it into almost like a thunder cracking sort of sound, especially when you pitch it down. So to get that layer fitting a little bit better in the mix, this is the processing that I applied, starting with a high pass filter, and then followed up with a little bit of stereo width control, turned down to 42%. Now onto layer 2 of the cast. This one I'm particularly proud of. It goes like this. Kind of liquidy, modulated explosion sort of sound. This is really the rubber raincoat, which sounds like this, slowed down a little bit. And then I applied this processing chain. I'm particularly a fan of how liquidy it sort of sounds, and I think that's a lot to be attributed to M ratio MB, which takes out some of the noise after it's brought up by Devil Lock, and then also M vocoder, which does the sort of band split vocode trick that I've shown before. And then here's the processing that I did on that track to get this layer to sit a little bit better, starting with stereo width control down 50%, and then also high passing yet again 106 Hertz. And here's layer 3. That's the same process that I just showed, the raincoat modulation. I just picked a different portion of the source file and then layered it with layer 2 to extend it in a way. That's what those two layers sound like together. And then we have layer 4. This one is also a sort of denoised liquidy whoosh sound. Looks like I called it Z-Noise Flingo. The original part of the source file this is from sounded like this. This is our whoosh output. That's just the nylon jacket. And then here's the processing chain that I applied to that. All that could probably be accomplished with a more efficient, I guess, plugin chain, but I've had this one for a while and I've just been building on it, so that's what it took and that's how I made it. For the mix processing on this layer, it's a similar approach as you've seen before, starting with Pro Q, doing some reduction in the high end, then some stereo width reduction, and some soothe also to tame the sort of zippy, shrill high end in there a little bit more. Here's the delta. Some of that stuff just pierces the ear in an unpleasing way, I think. For layer 5, that goes like this. This one's pretty subtle. Sometimes in a lot of these Magic casts, you'll hear like these really fast, whippy, zippy sounds. So that's what I was going for here. The source file that this was taken from is the screwdriver scrapes on the raincoat. And then I just used this processing chain. I think that's a bit cheesy in isolation, especially with the slapback delay thing going on with Crystallizer, but once you mix it in and speed it up a little bit, I think it adds a tiny stylish flair that I miss when it's not there. At regular speed, it sounds like this, and then I just sped it up quite a bit. And then the mix processing to get it sit a little better is just stereo width control, so it isn't so incredibly wide. So layer 6 sounds like this. And that's to add a punctuated hit to the middle of the cast, which would otherwise be very whoosh heavy, and sort of add the feeling of a projectile being created. To create that transient, I used Traveler this time around, and that processing chain looks like this. You can hear it's got a nice tactile snap to it. And then this is the mix processing I applied on the track. Starting with Pro Q. That's just to tame the high end, followed up with a transient designer to increase the punch. And smack, and lower to add some more bassy oomph. And then finally we have layer 7, which goes like this. And bear with me because this is quite the processing chain. But I wanted to create a sort of bassy lead-in to the rest of the sound and the impact. So for the source, this is the rubber raincoat, which goes like this. And in a way, that source kind of doesn't matter because of the processing that I applied to it, which is this. think a big part of this chain was just me trying to justify the purchase of these like analog modeled plugins that I usually don't use otherwise, because I think they're just like targeted towards like music production or whatever. But the funny thing there is I didn't even use the impact, even though a lot of that processing was to like create an impact, because the portion I picked was just this. And that's actually just everything after the impact slowed down a lot. So here it is from the start. And I just used that little snippet at the end. Kind of funny, I don't know. And then I applied some additional processing, both to mix it and also distort it and get more of that crunchiness out of it. I believe what I was going for here was almost like the sound of a speaker being overblown and overdriven with sub, but not actually having any sub content in there. So that sort of bass boosty sound. So all those layers we've heard thus far combined sounds like this. And that covers the cast portion of our sound. So moving on to the impact now, starting with the first layer, this sounds like this. It's kind of subtle. This also contributes to the lead-in part right before the transient smacks you. This is also derived from the screwdriver scrape recording. It's just slowed down a lot. The original speed was this. And we pitched it down to 0.165, quite extreme. The processing chain goes like this. Kind of a short chain in comparison to what you've been hearing. I mainly wanted to accentuate and then isolate those tonal elements you were hearing. The portion of that file that I picked here is actually quite quiet by comparison, and it has a fade in, but without all of that, it would sound more like this. But I just wanted that tiny snippet right at the start, and then I applied this processing to sort of center it a little bit and control the stereo width, and then some additional frequency shifting to give it some more modulation. For layer 2, we're moving on to the impact itself, starting with a simple bass hit. And the processing chain for this one is actually the same like Saturn feedback analog plugin chain I showed you before. But I noticed that if you just like start and stop the playback, it just creates these little pops. And that's just from double tapping the spacebar to stop and start the transport. I don't know if it's like Traveler creating like some little artifacts that are being accented by the plugins down the chain, but you get a lot of stuff that's almost like little kick drums. I think I just messed around with certain plugins enabled and disabled to get just the right thumpy character I was looking for. Here's the mix processing I applied to that. And my philosophy here was to accentuate the thump while also taming the click at the top end. Moving on to layer 3, we have this. And that's almost this blunted transient, which doesn't have too much punch, but I added some mix processing to it later to get it more where I wanted. And for this processing chain, this is the same one that you saw earlier. It's the Z-Noise Flingo one. It's just applied to a different portion of the source file. I reached for one of my Whoosh processed files here, and at regular playback speed, it goes more like this. And then I just cut straight to the transient part of it and pitched it down, looks like half time. I'm not going to run through that whole plugin chain again, but I will show you a couple variations of what it can produce. From there, I applied just a little bit more processing to control the stereo width as always, and also add a little bit of kick as well. For layer 4, we have our last transient layer. It sounds like this. If you remember from earlier, the source here is actually that same Traveler impact patch that I made, and then I just applied this processing chain to dial up the punch factor and also add some sweepiness. Shout out to my friend Alex, who helped me co-create this Pro MB preset. I made this mid-range band, low mid-range band that gets ducked based on the content of the actual bass. And he made this bass frequency expander that also like tightens up the low end as well. And he also coined the very accurate name, Mr. Clean Bottom. I just applied a little bit of additional processing to get this layer to fit in a little bit better, starting with some SPL, Transient Designer, to turn up the punch yet again. And then Pro Q to do some more frequency shaping based on the content of some of the other transients that we have overlapping. Next we have layers 5, 6, and 7. Those sound like this individually. And as you might have been able to detect, those are all from the real ADT paper distorted flangey processing that I did earlier on. They're just different segments of that same source file. So I'm not going to go through the whole chain all over again. It's, again, this one. But I will show you how I mixed each of those layers individually. So layer 5 first. Next is layer 6. Again, just balancing the mid frequencies a little bit here. And then layer 7, which has some stereo width control and also some fun Pro Q filter sweeping. Just those 3 Thunder layers combined sound like this together. Now that you've heard that it's paper, it's kind of hard to unhear that, but in the mix, I think it combines well with everything else and sort of sells the effect of thunder crackling. For layer 8, this is me straight up ripping off the Arcane tonal ring out thing that they do. I thought it was a pretty cool design choice that they made in the show, but I gotta be honest, I mostly just wanted to see if I could get that similar result while starting from Raincoat sounds. So buckle up, here we go. Here's the raw Raincoat movement. But the source file almost doesn't matter anyways, because we're going to be hitting it with a classic Demon MS feedback mania right off the bat. And you can tell that pretty much just overrides whatever we put into it. Then I just bounced that tone feedback thing out and didn't even bother like making clean loops. I'll just duplicate it to get a bunch of sustained content. I don't care about the clicks or pops, and then I ran it through this effects chain. And finally, I just narrowed it down and turned up the pitch a little bit to get it sitting properly. And finally, we have layers 9 and 10, which are really not that special. These are just the raw outputs from Whoosh. Former is the impact, and latter is the basic one that I showed you earlier. I just applied some processing to add some physicality and weight. So layer 9 sounds like this. And that's just this portion of the Whoosh impact file. I just took off the transient essentially, then I applied this processing to it. The split band saturation you see I'm doing with Saturn here is the classic trick to get bass frequencies to translate better over smaller speakers, and also just gives it more texture, I think, as well. And then I just followed that up with a high and low pass filter. In isolation, layer 10 goes like this, which is this portion of the Whoosh file. I just trimmed up a bit. And slowed down considerably, and then I applied some processing to the track because really all I wanted here was just some low mid sustain. That's pretty funny. This is the first time I'm seeing it, but I think I isolated the low band on this and I just forgot about it. Like the full frequency would be this. But I just left the bass band and neutron isolated and I carried forward with my design from there. But there you go. So all the impact layers sound like this combined. And then I did some bus processing here to turn up the punch just a little bit and shape it more with neutron. You can see I'm increasing the crispiness on that high-end snap a bit, and then control and shape the high-end just a little bit as well. And the last little trick I applied here is with the Reverb Send. I don't usually do these, but I was making a little fun design sound. So you can see all these tracks that are not the transients, but the more sustained portions. So layers 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 that have this extra yellow routing bar on them are routed to a reverb return right here, which just has Pro R and a high pass filter. And that sounds like this. It's kind of subtle, but combined with the full impact mix, it just adds this nice little sheen and sense of space, especially to the tonal ringing out. Okay, now everything together with the cast and the impact, it sounds like this combined without our mastering process. Which is cool, it has some great character, but I just want to polish it a little bit more, so starting out with a classic Dean and Gun Bite enhancer with the low mid band on. Following that up with my friend Max's Pro MB mastering preset. And my friend Pax turned me onto this one. This is a mastering console all-in-one sort of plugin. It's got some EQ over here, some compression and saturation, and a little bit of stereo width control and transient modulation over here. And I just like the effect it has. It's a nice touch, and also makes it sound 100% more orange. Then we have Gullfoss. With some typical spectral balancing, followed up by another Pro MB. This one is to control the low end as I usually do. This helps it feel a lot less congested. Then we have Soothe to control some of those high peaks. I just can't help myself. I always have to listen to the delta. It's so cool and digital and liquidy. Anyways, moving on, we have Saturn to soft clip. And finally, our last limiter. Just for fun, I'm going to do a quick A/B with all of the mixing turned off, just so you can hear the cumulative effect that it all has. And that's all I got. Thanks for sticking with me and giving it a listen.